This video is all about, as you can see here, why. Why did things happen? What lay behind the different changes that we see in crimes, punishments and law enforcement? And it's going to really help with those 16 mark questions which do often ask why, as we shall see. Now, in terms of what affected crime and punishment in the medieval period, the king, or the monarch, was the big deciding factor. Power was in the hands of one person. There were a few nobles who were powerful that he might occasionally have to listen to, for example with Magna Carta and the limits placed on kings. But largely, if the king decided something was going to happen, it happened. And that influenced crime and punishment a lot, as we shall see. Linking to that, of course, is God and religion. Things like trial by ordeal and sanctuary and the neck verse, all of these things link to this deep belief in religion, which also links to the kings thing, because people listen to kings, they believed that God had put kings on the throne, and therefore if a king says something, it's something that you have to listen to. Linked to this, which is also a problem in the next period, as we'll see, is there's a lack of effective law enforcement. This, for example, explains why punishments were often very public and very harsh, because it was an attempt to deter other potential criminals from wanting to commit crime. Things change, of course, into the early modern period. You get in this period a lot of turmoil, you get changes. For example, you get urbanisation. People, which means people moving to the cities and the towns, and those things growing, which links to increased travel. Now, both of those things give criminals an opportunity. In bigger cities, it's easier to get away with crime, there are more targets. With regards to travel, you get things like highwaymen. And still, there are similarities though. There's still a lack of effective law enforcement. Some law enforcement has to change because of urbanisation. Things like hue and cry and tithings, they don't work any longer. And the monarch still holds a lot of power. They have a huge influence still over law and order, crime and punishment. But slightly less so, perhaps, slightly less power, because there's Parliament by this point, especially after the English Civil War. But people like Henry VIII, they bring about the English Reformation. Bloody Mary has people famously executed for not agreeing to become Catholic. You've got James I writing his demonology book, and the various different laws made about witches. There's just a lot of quite a number of traumatic events for people at the time. The English Reformation, I mean, you've got to really understand how important religion was to people at the time to really understand why that Reformation affected people so much. And they must have felt real inner pain trying to work out whether it was right to be Catholic, whether it was right to Protestant, how to proceed with things. And then the English Civil War was devastating to the country. And with regards to that turmoil, that religious turmoil and the English Civil War brought about the execution of a monarch and a government in what's called the interregnum, which was a Puritan government, really strict Protestants, and they did things like ban the celebration aspect of Christmas. So that's where those two things combined. That increased travel later on becomes travel abroad. So we get things like transportation as a punishment. So there are some continuities, as I've mentioned, but there are things that start to change. It's called the early modern period for a reason. You start to see some aspects of a more modern England. Now, there's one huge change in the industrial period, and that I would point out as the wealth of this country. The country transformed to becoming the most powerful nation on the planet, controlling countries all around the world. The industry that you can see in the pictures there brought a lot of that huge wealth, and that meant it was possible for the government to do more and to pay for more through the taxes that it collected. Most famously in this period, prisons. The prison system is so expensive, and the police also hugely expensive. They couldn't have happened before this period because we wouldn't have had the systems in place and the wealth in particular to be able to do it. There's a continuation of the urbanisation. London is the first place that the police force is created because it's a completely overcrowded city. Crime was getting out of control. And this is where it links to historical events there. The French Revolution, which led to the people in control of the government of France losing their heads, being executed and being overthrown, this scared the people in charge of this country because they didn't want the same thing to happen to them. This has an influence on their actions and for law enforcement. This is one reason, for example, of why we got a police force. But it's also has an impact on incidents like the Tolpuddle Martyrs, where the people who were trying to organise a trade union, a form of protest, sort of to get their own power over landowners, were treated incredibly harshly. It all links back to that French Revolution. And finally, in this period, attitudes start to change. Attitudes towards how people should be treated and how crime and punishment should be done. I mean, it's not on here, but there is the growth of the media in this period to spread those ideas and an increase in literacy. People could actually read the things like the newspapers. So, to give some examples, you get the book of John Howard, which calls for changes in the prison system, and it has an influence. You get people like, as I go back, it leads to things like the Jails Act, ultimately, and it also leads to the work of people like Elizabeth Fry, who also tries to campaign to improve prisons. Then you've got people like Charles Dickens, very famous man. You've probably heard of him. He was a famous man then as well, writing about how public executions should end and how they'd become like a circus rather than something that was striking fear into the hearts of people. And his writings, and the writings of other people too on that sort of thing, influenced the ending of public executions. So attitudes also have an impact at this time. Now, there's really two main things that affect crimes, punishment and law enforcement in the modern period. Attitudes and technology. They have a huge impact. To give one example, in 1900, it was against the law to be homosexual. Now, it's against the law to be homophobic and to do a hate crime against somebody for their sexuality, for being a homosexual. It's a complete about turn. And that's all down to attitudes of society. Technology has particularly affected law enforcement and punishments as well, and the crimes. Crimes, cybercrime, is a crime because of technology. There's lots of different crimes related to cars which requires technology. Punishments, electronic tagging, for example, is something that couldn't happen without technology. And law enforcement, the police use telephones, walkie-talkies, helicopters. There's police involved in combating cybercrime who just sit on computers doing that all day long. And all of these things, the punishments and the police, again cost huge sums of money. And society in our country has advanced further even since the industrial period so that we can afford even more as a society. One last thing, of course, the World Wars is there in the middle because that affects law enforcement with regard particularly to conscientious objectors. It was against the law suddenly to not join the army. That only happened during the World Wars. And it also does have an effect on the ending of the death penalty because sort of a move after the Second World War away from things that were associated with Hitler and the Nazis, which were executions. And that helps to change attitudes to go turning against executions as the death penalty as a normal form of punishment, which of course then ends in 1965. It's always important when you're doing some revision to think about exam questions. That's ultimately what you're going to get asked. So I've included some here which are relevant to some of the things that we've been talking about. I haven't talked about everything that's in all of these exam questions. We'd have been here all night. So you're going to maybe have to get your revision guide out to have a think. This is where you send me an email, you come and see me, you ask about anything that you're unsure of. So I would pause this, have a good look, and have a good look review of that. And I hope this video was useful.